Did the war in the soldiers' eyes, how did that differ from maybe what Hollywood shows the World War One as, like Warhorse or 19 what was it? What was the film called?
1917.
1917, yeah.
I mean,
How did it differ?
1917 is pretty accurate, to be honest with you. I mean, I did a podcast on it, and it's kind of people think that the whole kind of landscape in it of these green fields and so is all wrong, but it's not for that period of the war in which there was a movement away from locations where there've been long periods of static trench warfare to a new trench system. But in terms of the reality of war and how it's depicted in popular fiction or popular media like film, I mean, obviously, it's a big gulf between those two things. And these men never ever, the commonality, they never saw themselves as heroes and would never project themselves as heroes. That is a phrase that I never heard any of them use. And I've interviewed probably over 1,000 veterans of the Second World War.
Yeah.
And that, again, that is not something that they would ever say about themselves. They might say about people that they witnessed do incredible things, but they would never project themselves in that way. And these men were like that. And some, they were, I mean, I knew men who'd been decorated for gallantry with the military medal. One guy had fired a Lewis gun down a trench when they'd captured a German position on the first day of the Somme, and he got the MM for defending what was left of their battalion, having got into the German lines, things like this. But they would always talk about it in a very kind of almost detached way, that it was someone else, not them. And their experience of war, I think what was common was that they always saw death as random. That they, one of them, he'd gone over the top again on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And Reg Glenn, his name was, he was from Sheffield in the Sheffield City Battalion. And as he was going forward, attached to an infantry platoon, because he was a signaller, he suddenly saw these guys all disappear into the grass. And he thought an officer had given instructions to take cover because he could see fire coming at them from at the top of this hill. And so he ducked. And what he was actually seeing was the machine guns traverse along these guys and mow them down. And he ducked at the right moment and survived. And he could never really square that in his mind, that he'd survived and they hadn't. And, he in fact, one of his favourite phrases was this idea that that when you scythe a field of corn, even with the most advanced scything machine, there would always be one or two stems that would somehow survive. And and many of them, Alf Rosell, another one who fought on the Somme with the Royal Fusiliers, used to say the same. Somehow the war was like that. There's no rhyme or reason to it. But they felt guilty about surviving. There's no doubt about that.
It sounds a bit like imposter syndrome, like, oh, I'm not a hero, I didn't do anything special, and they, like you just mentioned, them feeling guilty about surviving. Do you think it's kind of that imposter syndrome in a way?
I think that they would never have, they knew when you came back from a war like the First World War, millions of men had served in the army. You weren't anything special simply because you'd been in the trenches. They had their own kind of pecking order of what they saw, who had done what. So there was a phrase in the war, base waller, which was somebody who never went anywhere near the trenches. You stayed at the base, you drove a lorry, you baked bread, you unloaded stores from ships or whatever it was. And those jobs are incredibly important because you can't feed a war, you can't keep a war going without supply. It's not as sexy as combat, there's no big kind of war stories to tell, but it's really important. But those kind of men were not really liked by the ones who had seen the sharp end of war, because they saw them having kind of cushy, easy jobs away from the battlefield and plenty of food and plenty of pay and plenty of mademoiselles and things like this. And they're up in the front line in mud and muck and slime doing their bit, pushing Jerry back on the battlefields. So, I don't think there was as much imposter syndrome, but they just weren't people that would ever project themselves as heroes, because they were a cog in a wheel, and their service was the same as others who'd served alongside them. We would see it differently, because no man can give more than his own life, and these men had enlisted, and part of their promise was potentially to give that life. So, to say the least, hats off to them.
Yeah, definitely, to say the least. I've read that trench warfare could be described as kind of long periods of being homesick and long periods of boredom, followed by short, intense bursts of terror. From your interviews with the veterans, how does their account of trench life differ from that viewpoint?
I think that's pretty spot on, to be quite honest with you. I think most war is like that, where the kind of sharp end bit of it, where there's lots of stuff going on, and it gets pretty intense, is pretty small compared to the rest of the time when you're sitting around on your backside doing nothing really. And these men, when they were in trenches on static periods of the front, they would typically do 7 to 10 days in the forward zone of the battlefield. I mean, not even all of that was in the very front line, because they'd rotate them between the front line, the support line, and the reserve line over a period of days. And in the front line, you would be on pretty much permanent duty because Germans are not very far away. You'd be looking through trench periscopes into no man's land to make sure the Germans weren't doing anything. You'd be ready with your weapons. You'd be on the fire step in the morning, at dawn, and at dusk, because those are traditional times in which an enemy might attack. And you wouldn't be doing a lot of labouring, but you would be doing the sharp end of soldiering. Now, you do that for a few days, and then you'd be sent back to the support line, and there you'd be doing more labouring than fighting or soldiering, repairing trenches, bringing up supplies, carrying the ammunition up, carrying the food up for the men in the front line, and all that kind of stuff. And then the same in the reserve line. But each of those areas, there were still moments in which nothing was happening. And boredom is not a word that many people would use in association with the First World War, but there were periods in which these men were bored.
Hmm.
So they invent games and they gamble with what little pay they've got. A favourite one was 2 Up, where they'd throw old pennies up in the air and gamble on the outcome of how they would land, for example. But some sat there, wrote diaries, wrote letters home, read letters from home. I mean, the post was incredibly important, and they had to find things to do in those hours in which there was literally nothing going on as such on the battlefields. But death always ever present, with the random explosion of a shell or a rifle grenade or a burst of machine gun fire, whatever it was.
Yeah, so that randomness, if you're on the front line, how frequent is that kind of random machine gun fire or shell hitting your trenches? Is it every single day you're within meters of getting hit or shot, or is it kind of just sporadic, super random, maybe every few days on the front line?
I mean, there would be shell fire every day, and certainly the Germans like to do what the British eventually called morning hate, where they'd drop shells onto a position in the morning because they knew the British were standing to at dawn. But during the course of a day, I mean, as weapons like trench mortars came in, which were portable mortar weapons that could be moved around within a trench system and then launch projectiles over the battlefield at the enemy positions. Once that kind of weapon was being used, and then rifle grenades is another example of that, they could set up almost anywhere with these weapons, fire off a few rounds, and then leg it. And then the guys on the other side of no man's land would get the sharp end of it. So in the British trench mortars, for example, they could get 6 to 8 bombs in the air before the first one landed. So they'd fire off a little salvo, pack up their gear, and go back down the communication trenches. And then a few Jerrys would get walloped by this stuff, and they wouldn't like that. So they'd send over some of their trench mortars or call up some defensive artillery fire. And the frontline trenches got bombarded, and people who were 1 minute writing a letter or reading a letter from home have been hit by shell fire and are wounded or killed. And you see this in war diaries. I mean, every unit kept a diary, and in there you see phrases like, 5th of January 1916, nothing of importance, 3 men killed, 5 men wounded.
Wow. Yeah.
So, it's not that people were more callous then, but I think that was the reality of fighting a war on that scale against an enemy like Imperial Germany.
Yeah. And what are some of the craziest or most memorable stories the veterans have shared with you?
I mean, there's lots of poignant, sad ones where they've lost mates. I mean, the guys that were in the artillery, they were pretty much all horse-drawn, their limbers and their field guns. And, you mentioned Warhorse earlier, which I took my daughter to see many years ago, and it's an incredibly kind of powerful thing, the stage version of it, as well as the film. And it brought back a lot of memories for me of listening to veterans cry more about their horses that were killed and wounded
Really?
than some of their mates, because they developed this strong
Yeah.
bond with them. Being with them in some cases for years on the Western Front. So there was that kind of thing, but there were crazy things as well. I mean, one guy described how a guy in his unit had been killed on the toilet. So they had their toilet was a shell hole behind the trench, which you got to through a little sap, a little side trench, and they'd put a wooden pole across it so you could sit on it. And the shell hole was now full of human waste, which of course attracted flies. And the guy went in there to go to the toilet and dispersed the flies as he came in. And some sharp German on the other side of no man's land noticed this and realised that somebody must be in there. So they sent over a salvo of shells, and he was killed going to the loo. So there were those kind of things, really. But the way they described, I think, the battlefield, because it's difficult for us to imagine no man's land,
Yeah.
and there wasn't one no man's land. No man's lands could be kind of different depending on what battle it was. So on the Somme, it was farmland that had been overgrown since 1914, and when they went over the top at the beginning, it was full of wild flowers, poppies and blue cornflowers, and there were birds on the wire and skylarks in the air and things like this. I mean, it was no man's land then was an area of what we call wilding now.
Mm.
It's crazy to think the kind of nature almost thrived in that. And then, I think of others who went on to fight at Passchendaele in 1917 in the Third Battle of Ypres, where it was a lunar landscape of shell holes. And when they looked out into no man's land, it was like looking at some kind of alien planet to them. I mean, again, those were phrases they didn't use, but it would have, to use that phrase, alien landscape, I think is not even doing it justice, because it's hard for us to imagine what it must have looked like.
Yeah, I think the painter's called Paul Nash. I think his surname's Nash.
Yep.
That's what I imagine when I see the front lines. Obviously, a bit kind of surrealist or impressionistic account of it. But how wide was no man's land? What was the distance typically? I mean, it depends on the battle, but let's just say in the Somme, what was the closest point between the two enemy trenches in that war?
I mean, it could be tens of yards. So they could be
Wow.
literally close enough to almost put their hand over the top of the parapet and shake hands with the Germans on the other side of a little strip of land. That was normally because this might be an area where there'd been a bit of fighting before, and one side had captured a bit of a trench that was very close to another bit of trench that had once been German. So the British inherited one or two French positions like that, which was the result of the 1915 battles on the Somme. But generally, it was, I mean, the average no man's land could be 100, 200 yards across. There were some places where it was very wide. So there was one area at La Boisselle in Mash Valley where it was almost an entire map square across, which is, 500 yards plus. And that meant that the men had quite a distance to cross in broad daylight when they went over the top there. Which of course didn't matter because all the Germans had been killed by artillery fire until, of course, they weren't.
Yep.
And that was, of course, what they discovered. So it's a strange kind of world, really, the landscape of the Western Front, because there can be bits where men are very far apart and the enemy looks very distant, and there are other parts where they're very close indeed. And quite a few of the guys I interviewed, particularly the officers who've been educated at public school, could speak German, or at least speak some German. And they used to hear the conversations of Germans just across no man's land in these
Wow.
trenches. And no doubt the Germans heard the same, So it's extraordinary to think that you had millions of men really almost living on top of each other.
Yeah, and it's just the uncertainty of whether they're going to come over, being that close as well. You're not going to sleep well. And speaking of sleep, did the veterans mention how little sleep they got on the front line? Because I've heard sometimes it was 2 to 4 hours when you're right on the front line. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, you would always be, if you were in the very front line, you'd be snatching sleep. And you've got to be careful not to sleep when you're on sentry go, because that is an offence which, can lead to some quite dire consequences. But it's amazing when you have been in battle, or when you are in battle, how easy it is to sleep, because you're so tired by the experience of it, that any opportunity when you're given, just a couple of hours to climb into what the soldiers call a funk hole, which is a kind of scrape in the side of the trench with a bit of wobbly tin, and maybe a bit of wooden flooring. You crawl in there with a ground sheet, and you think there's no way you'll be able to sleep in there with whatever may or may not be happening on the other side of the battlefield or whatever noise. But believe me, these guys were out like a light, and often had to be shook awake to get them up to do something. Other men were so petrified that they couldn't sleep when they were in the front line because of this randomness of death, and a few of them said they struggled to cope with that. And you read that a lot in memoirs of the First World War. Again, for every man, it would be different. I mean, I did a lot of when I lived in Yorkshire. I did a lot of research on the guys that had been miners who served in units like the Barnsley Pals, and these were tough blokes. They'd lived tough lives. They'd left school at 12, gone straight into a pit, and which was by no means any kind of cushy, easy job in any shape or form. And I don't think it necessarily fully prepared them for the First World War, but it brought them into a world of hard knocks and a life that could be very, very difficult. So some men, I think, cope better than others. I mean, I knew some guys like that. And then contrast one, Leslie Lovegrove. He was an officer in the South Lancashire Regiment. He was commissioned at 18. He looks about 12 in the photographs of him. And he was so weak that he couldn't actually hold his revolver in his hand with his arm stretched out. And the one and only time he fired it, the blast from it, it's a 4.55 Webley revolver. He fell over, and he never fired it again. Every time he went over the top carrying this weapon, it wasn't loaded because he just couldn't operate it. And if he tried to, he'd be on his back, and he couldn't do that in front of his men. So, so yeah, I mean, it was a citizen army, by 1918, made up of millions of conscripts. So you get all kinds of men from all kinds of backgrounds who cope with this in all kinds of ways.
Yeah. And did any veterans you meet ever play that Christmas Day football match with the Germans? And did they ever experience stuff like gas or the first arrival of a tank? Do you have any stories about that, them pivotal moments? Or
I mean, you've got to be careful with the football story because there's a couple of examples of kick-arounds. I'm afraid I don't subscribe because there's no evidence to this idea of big football matches where, England versus Germany, half a century before 1966, and all that kind of stuff. But, I did interview men who were in the Christmas Truce, two men who were in the London Regiment, for example, who were on the southern part of the battlefield in Flanders and went out. And, they found it quite difficult to kind of stand there with an enemy that you've been told was barbaric and terrible and the evil Hun and, all this kind of propaganda that they've been really kind of rammed down their throats since the start of the war. And there they were staring at fellow human beings in no man's land and swapping cigarettes and chocolate and drink, bit of whiskey or rum for some schnapps or, whatever it was. So yeah, some did that. And then several of them were gassed. Harry Coates, he'd been a typist before the First World War, joined the London Scottish, and he was gassed at the Battle of Lewes in 1915. And his best mate was alongside him and got hit, and he was gassed. And he paused to kind of look at him, and he saw these two dead eyes looking out of the eyepieces of the gas mask and realised his mate was dead. And then he caught a whiff of gas himself that took him out of the battle area and back to hospital. But the medical officer wasn't very sympathetic to his condition, so he told him to smoke more, and because in those days, a lot of people believe that smoking could cure things. Smoke a bit more and then go back up the line. And he got back to his battalion, and the commanding officer looked at him and he said, "There's no way you're fit to be back here." He said, "Didn't you do the Pitman's typing course before the war?" He said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Report to brigade headquarters, they're short of a typist." So he ended up on the brigade HQ staff, which probably saved his life, to be honest with you, and also made him an incredibly interesting veteran to talk to because he saw a lot more of the war rather than a narrow front in a trench or a dugout or a machine gun position. He was there at brigade headquarters, and he got very friendly with the brigade major, who was the officer who kind of helped the brigadier, and the brigadier himself. And on the first day of the Somme, he was in the dugout with two of them, watching their brigade go forward and sadly get massacred. And the brigadier got shell shock as a consequence of it, seeing all these men get mowed down. They had to help him out the dugout, and he wasn't really fit to command again as a consequence of that.
Wow. And what about tanks? What year did the tanks come about into the trenches? And do you have any stories about veterans' experience of that?
So that was the Battle of the Somme. It was in an action called Flers Courcelette, when more than 40 tanks were used on the 15th of September 1916. They were Mark I tanks, so they weren't armoured. They were boilerplate, and bullets striking them could cause fragments of metal to come off on the inside white hot.
Wow.
So a lot of the early tank crews wore chainmail masks to protect their face from these fragments. And they had internal exhaust, so carbon monoxide came into the
Wow.
fighting cabin of the vehicle while they were operating it. So they were boiling hot, full of noxious fumes, and could easily have bits of metal flying around that could, kill you or certainly seriously injure you. And if they caught fire, there's no way out of these things, and death is going to be pretty gruesome and terrible, as sadly it was for so many tank crews in the First World War. But yeah, I mean, I didn't interview anyone who was actually in the tanks, but plenty of guys that served with the tanks. And Lance Catamol, who was the Canadian who fought at the Courcelette, his unit went forward with the tanks in the attack on a sugar factory there, and a position called Sugar Trench, which his battalion assisted in capturing with tanks. And I mean, even then, they didn't really know what they were. I mean, this kind of box that could move forward, bristling with guns, suddenly appears. And some units had been trained with them, but they hadn't. And they were kind of told at the last minute what these things were. And the Germans, of course, didn't really have any idea what these things were either. And they didn't actually have a name for them at the time. We'd think now they'd be called Panzer, and Panzer is the German for armor. So that wasn't a phrase that they necessarily used. But some years ago, I was working in the German archives in Stuttgart and came across an account of the first use of tanks that was then typed up and sent round to all the German units so they could get an idea of what these things were. And they called them in this kind of typical German word where they stick a few words together, and it became armoured agricultural threshing machine. Because they just didn't understand what they were. And it's a rhomboid-shaped vehicle with big wheels on the back of it, which they eventually discarded because they get tangled up in barbed wire. They weren't really sure what it was or what it could do. But, imagine being a German soldier on the first day of the use of tanks, seeing one of these things coming towards you, firing 6-pounder shells at close range. And the original ones had Vickers machine guns in them with a high rate of fire. Later ones had Lewis guns. And, you've got a lot of fire coming your way from an armoured box.
Yeah.
So as an infantry soldier with a rifle and a bayonet, initially there's not a lot you can do about it, but the Germans worked out ways to immobilise them with their stick grenades.
Yeah.
By putting them into a bundle of grenades with one handle and a detonator, and chucking it under the tracks and blow the track off, and then the crew would abandon the vehicle. That was the kind of idea. So, yeah, it's kind of crazy really to think that was a weapon that was being used in the same battle that cavalry had been used. There was a cavalry charge on the Somme in 1916, and then a couple of months later, tanks were used. But by the end of the war, I mean, that whole movement of technology had heralded a new type of warfare and proper modern armies in many ways.
Yeah, that's one of the things war can do. It can really advance technology like we saw with the nuclear bombs in World War II. What about flamethrowers? Because they're kind of infamous in World War II alongside gas, but how common were flamethrowers?
I mean, they were used by all sides. I mean, they were technology that existed at the beginning of the war. The Germans, we often read that the British first encountered them at Ypres in 1915, which is true, but the Germans had that technology from the beginning of the conflict, and they used them against some French forts in 1914. These were quite big flamethrowers. Then they developed man-portable ones that you could have a canister on the back of a soldier with enough fuel in there for 3, 4, 5 squirts of it, and then a big hose, and then go forward. And the Germans started to use that kind of weapon more and more to fill trenches full of liquid flame. And of course, in a close confine of a trench, where a flamethrower is being used, your chances of getting out of that is going to be pretty slim. But the British didn't really kind of invest in that. They tried these flamethrowers that you could install with long pipe systems, and like a head would pop up and it would launch a flame bombardment of a German position. But what we did instead is we had a weapon by 1916 called a Livens projector, which was a mortar weapon that fired this big sausage-shaped bomb that had poison gas in it. But they developed a version that had a kind of napalm in it. So liquid fire that could be fired in canisters, and we called them oil drums. And they would fire those onto a German position, and 50, 100 would explode simultaneously,
Wow.
literally filling the whole area full of this highly flammable liquid with absolutely devastating effects. And so that was the kind of approach that we had, really, in terms of, the British had in terms of that. The French developed portable flamethrowers, and they used them quite extensively as well. I mean, but the thing about them is, they, the amount of fuel in them is small, so they're not going to last very long.
Yeah, and how come? I think I'm pretty sure gas was banned, right, in World War II. Technically, I mean, it could have been used. I'm not sure if it was used. But why were stuff like gas and flamethrowers and kind of sticky bombs? Maybe they were used in World War II, but it just seems like a lot of technology that was developed in World War One wasn't used, but could have been. Why was that? Was it just because it was too horrific?
Well, I think most of those weapons that you mentioned, with the exception of gas, were used. Flamethrowers were a massive part of both sides' kit. I mean, the British developed a flamethrower tank for Normandy called
Wow.
a Churchill Crocodile, and that had a trailer on the back of it full of liquid fuel that could be pumped through the vehicle to a flame head, and it could fire big long bursts. And I've interviewed guys that served with those in Normandy, and they had quite a fearsome reputation. The Germans just didn't like them, to say the least.
Yeah.
So flamethrowers were used, but poison gas was this thing. I mean, it's a horrific weapon. It was banned before the First World War under the Hague Convention, but a lot of countries had it, but didn't ever anticipate using it. But Germany in 1915 saw the First World War having turned into a Totalkrieg, a total war, felt that it was justified to use any and every weapon. And they tested it first on the Eastern Front, and then brought it to the Western Front, and chemical warfare properly really began on the evening of the 22nd of April 1915, when chlorine gas was launched against French colonial, British and Canadian troops in Flanders. And so devastating was the effects of gas and the types of gas that was developed. In 1917, they brought in mustard gas, which was a chemical agent that burned you as well as choked you. So if you got it in your eyes, it could blind you. If you swallowed it, it could burn your internal organs. I mean, it's absolutely horrific. And if it got onto skin, it would burn as well. And I think because of all this, when it came to the Second World War, everyone thought gas would be used. Even in 1938, when they began civil defense measures, everybody was given gas masks, given gas drill, told what to do with gas, because they thought they would drop it on civilian targets in another world war. But it was never used. But even as late as D-Day, 1944, 6th of June, British soldiers landed on every single D-Day beach with a gas mask, thinking it was potentially going to be used to throw them back, but it wasn't.
Why wasn't it?
I think that's a good question. I mean, Hitler was gassed in the First World War with mustard gas. Whether he kind of felt that that was an experience. I mean, he had no qualms about gassing 6 million Jews in concentration camps.
Say, yeah.
On a battlefield, I guess he feared that if you use poison gas, then you're kind of ramping up the level of intensity of fighting. And I think the Germans feared that if they ever used it against a British civilian population, then it would be used against a German one.
Yeah, that would make sense. I mean, yeah, because as we were talking about gas just before you said it, I was thinking, oh wait, no, to be fair, gas was used, just not on soldiers in that regard. What were the pivotal moments that led up to the Somme campaign?
Well, the war on the Western Front, I mean, everyone went to war in 1914 ready for war, just not the war that the First World War turned into. They were imagining a war of mobility, but it became a static war with both sides dug in along this 450 miles of the Western Front. And 1915, there had been quite a few attempts to break that deadlock of trench warfare, not very successfully. But the British, having expanded their army, were able to extend their line along the Western Front, and they took over a position on the Somme with the French close by. So this idea developed in late 1915 of an Anglo-French offensive where France and Britain and its empire would rupture the German lines and bring the war to an end. But the Germans had other plans, and they launched an offensive at Verdun in February, which drew a lot of French manpower away from the Somme. And although Haig always was convinced that he'd be able to fight a knockout battle there in 1916, that there was no doubt that the Somme, one of the reasons it was fought was to help relieve pressure on the French army at Verdun. And I think there's no coincidence that the last German attacks at Verdun take place in the first week of July 1916, just as the British are advancing on the Somme, because the Germans can't sustain a offensive at Verdun and a defensive battle on the Somme.
Yeah, and the idea, as far as I'm aware, was in the Somme on the just before the first day, or on the first day, was to do a creeping barrage, and then the soldiers go over. And like we said earlier, the soldiers expected not many Germans to be left after that artillery. Why did the Allies underestimate the German defensive line, and how come the artillery wasn't as effective as planned?
Well, actually, they'd not developed creeping barrages properly at that point, so it was a kind of blunt instrument approach. And one of the problems in 1915, they'd not been able to produce as much shells as they'd wanted to, so that was kind of put to one side, and that problem was solved. So for the Somme, they had what seemed like unlimited ammunition for the guns, and in the end, over 7 days, 1.75 million shells were fired at the German lines from the village of Gommecourt in the north to Montauban in the south, which is roughly kind of 20-mile front. And everyone that was assembled for this battle was told that nothing would survive that bombardment. And a phrase that was actually used in some areas, nothing would survive, not even a rat. And all you're simply going to have to do is to walk across no man's land, occupy the enemy positions beyond. Someone else will pass through you, and we will be in the towns beyond the German line by nightfall. Berlin by Christmas, that kind of idea. And I think that everybody from private to field marshal would have believed this, because they'd seen these massive stockpiles of shells being built up for the bombardment. They'd seen through their trench periscopes the Germans being bombarded with just about every caliber of weapon night and day, and they thought, well, nothing can survive this. But we'd underestimated, really, the importance of landscape, and there on the Somme, which is chalk down land, the Germans had dug deep into it, and they had dugouts that were tens of feet beneath the surface. And even this kind of shallowest one, which was kind of 30 feet, some were much deeper than that, 80 feet even.
Wow.
They could shelter in those dugouts under which what they called trommel fire, drum fire, for the course of the 7 days, and then at 0 hour at 7:30 a.m. on the 1st of July, barrage lifted and moved on to other targets, and they come up out their dugouts, none of them having been killed or wounded, but with their weapons intact, ammunition ready, and they could then set up their guns and mow down the enemy coming into no man's land. And more importantly, we'd failed to take out their supporting artillery, so they could call in defensive fire and drop shells into no man's land on pre-designated areas, and the units that walked into that kind of fire really didn't stand a chance.
Yeah, and how deep were our trenches in comparison to those 30 to 80 feet trenches? Was ours much shallower?
So, I mean, the British had dugouts, but we didn't generally build, until later on in the war, we didn't really build dugouts at that kind of depth, because our view was, we're always going to attack, we're always going to move forward. Don't build up too much infrastructure in these trenches, because we don't want the soldiers getting too comfy, because at some point they're going to have to be leaving these trenches and moving forward. Whereas the German kind of view of this for most of the war was a defensive view, So you do want infrastructure, you do want deep defences, you do want very well constructed machine gun bunkers and trench mortar positions that are impervious to shell fire, because if you've got your weapons and your garrison intact, the enemy's never going to take that position. So we underestimated that. I mean, the average trench is, kind of 6 to 8 feet deep, depending on where it is. The actual trench itself probably not as deep as that, but made up with sandbags to artificially deepen it. And in some areas where the water table is an issue, you can't dig very deep anyway without the trench filling up with water. So you build up what's called a breastwork, which is a position up above ground level. So the trenches themselves were not necessarily, they needed to be so deep so that the men could be protected from shrapnel fire, but they needed to be not too deep. They couldn't get out of them to make an attack, and ladders were built to get them out. In some trenches, they constructed ramps to allow much quicker access out into no man's land to make the advance. But the dugouts, which they slept in and which their quarters were in and which the Germans used much more intensively than we did, were much deeper.
Yeah, and how come they were able to be so deep and not get flooded? Is that just because it was above the water table?
Well, particularly on the Somme, because you've got a chalk landscape, the drainage is very good.
Mm.
So, I mean, in the week leading up to the Battle of the Somme, there was quite a lot of heavy rainfall, and there was some flooding in some trenches, but the positions were so well constructed, and the Germans, again, one of the things that I've kind of encountered with battlefield archaeology is just how incredibly well built German drainage systems were to drain away water in battlefields where that is a big problem. So they could have these deep dugouts that were impervious to not only shells but to being flooded, and that they were safe and deep and dry, and would protect those who were in there. There was always the risk you could be buried alive in there if the entrance was blown in. But the British didn't use enough high caliber shells for that Somme bombardment. That was one of the lessons of it. So a lot of the shells were the 18-pounder standard field artillery shells, and most of those were shrapnel to cut barbed wire, and those kind of shells couldn't knock out dugouts at that kind of depth.
Yeah, that's another mistake that you've mentioned, and I'm wondering if there are any other fatal mistakes the Allies made when launching the Somme offensive.
Well, I mean, one of the least ideal kind of aspects of it was advancing in broad daylight.
Yeah.
And that was not a British decision, though, because even though the French were fighting at Verdun, French soldiers took part in the opening stage of the Battle of the Somme and would continue to take part in it for the rest of the 4.5 months of the battle. But they, being the senior ally on the Western Front, they held most of the 450 miles of the front, well over 300 miles of it. They dictated 0 hour for the Somme, and their troops were not trained to advance in the dark. So they required a 0 hour for where there was broad daylight, which was 7:30 in the morning. And having stood on the Somme battlefields, many times at 7:30 in the morning on the 1st of July, you have absolutely perfect visibility, which is great, for your advance, but your enemy has perfect visibility as well. And if they've survived, then you don't stand a chance if you're advancing in the open.
Yeah, especially there's so many of them with all their weapons, because some of it got damaged by any of the artillery. Why wasn't the offensive called off after such huge casualties on the first day? Was it just, just persevere, let's just get on with it? Like, how come they didn't try and change tactics so drastically after such a heavy casualty, or did they change their tactics quite quickly?
They did change their approach quite quickly, actually, and I think that one of the issues was that although it was known there had been severe casualties, this idea of the staggering level, 57,000 British and Commonwealth casualties on the first day of the Somme, that wasn't known not properly until after the war.
Mm.
And the figures came through that would have shown absolutely catastrophic casualties in certain divisions. But I think it took some time for headquarters to really kind of assemble that kind of information so it was meaningful to commanders. But on the ground, you see a change in tactics even 2 weeks later. So you mentioned creeping barrages. This was something that was known about, but not perfected. And on the 14th of July 1916, in a dawn attack. So instead of attacking in broad daylight, you attack at dawn where there's just enough light to see and just enough darkness to kind of give you a bit of an advantage. They launched the first proper British creeping barrage onto the German lines on the Somme, and enabled the units that attacked that day to capture a very wide area of German positions. So the methodology of fighting was continually adapted, and as the war went on, there were, I mean, in 1916, there were a lot of officers commanding units that were called dugouts. Now, that wasn't because they spent their time in a dugout, but they'd been dug out of retirement to come back and take command. And those men were found often to be unsuitable. And the army started clearing them out and promoting men who had commanded on the ground. So you could have guys that were platoon and company commanders on the Somme, and within a year, platoon commanders would be company commanders, and company commanders could end up being battalion commanders. And as you know, if they survived to the end of the war, they may well be commanding a brigade by then. So men who'd seen combat and had learned from it were promoted, and it enabled the army to kind of adapt and change the way that it fought these battles. And with the advance of technology and the improvement of weapons, and really the kind of combination of all these elements of fighting, enabled the army to become a proper modern army by 1918. It was like an orchestra. It's like somebody that conducts an orchestra. There was no orchestra in 1916, and there was certainly no conductor. But by within 2 years, everything was in its place, and it could be brought together, and it could be utilised properly, from machine guns to tanks to aircraft in the sky to signalling and all the other elements. And communications, of course, was a key issue. The inability to communicate was a big problem for First World War commanders.
Yeah. And if I'm correct in saying, was it November 1916 when the weather started deteriorating that Haig decided to shut down the Somme offensive? Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the conditions were beginning to change. I mean, halfway through the battle, when tanks were first used, the weather changed in late September, and it got more and more wet. And Somme mud, the chalk is good drainage, but the Somme mud becomes very, very thick, glutinous, and clingy. Not so much like Passchendaele, where it goes liquid and people can disappear in the mud. But the Somme mud kind of sticks to everything, and it makes movement very, very difficult indeed. And there was an attack in what's called the Battle of the Ancre on the 13th of November 1916, when infantry went forward, and one of the veterans I knew, Malcolm Vivian, he was a forward observer for artillery, and he watched the men from Hull, the Hull Pals, make an attack there, and literally get kind of bogged down in no man's land with this sticky mud, unable to move, and the machine guns just picked them off left, right, and centre. So it was realised that the conditions now, the weather, and it snowed in November as well. And the last attack on the 18th of November, when the Canadians went over the top at Desire Trench and British alongside them, it snowed very heavily, and you couldn't really continue to fight under those kind of conditions. And that turned out to be one of the coldest, if not the coldest, winter of the war, when temperatures on the Somme front dropped to nearly minus 25.
Wow. You could not expect that today. I could not imagine minus 25 in northern France. That's good that they kind of halted. What did they do once they halted the offensive? Did they retreat far away, or did they just regroup? And
no, because you'd be giving up ground then. So
Yeah.
you captured all these trenches, and you had to adapt them for you to sit still and wait until the next year to make the next offensive. And the Germans realised as well, when they looked at their defences, they realised although the British had not broken through on the Somme front, the Germans were now left holding a line that they couldn't hold indefinitely. And that during that winter of 1916-17, they made the decision to pull back and build a new system of defences, which became the Hindenburg Line. And when that was ready in the early part of 1917, that's when they began their withdrawal to it, and the British and Commonwealth forces kind of followed up behind, and the French to the south, and this kind of swinging, hinging door kind of thing swung back, and a new battlefield was created. And that's kind of what you see in the film 1917, that movement from the Somme front to the open fields where the Hindenburg Line had been dug, using forced labour and Russian prisoners of war, and all kinds of things.
Yeah, and am I correct in saying that over 600,000 Allies were Allied casualties were that happened for only 7 miles of gained territory in the Somme. Is that a correct statistic?
I mean, certainly the British Army lost over, British and Commonwealth forces lost over 450,000 men, of which 150,000 were killed or died of wounds. So, the men who fought there, they were a volunteer army. It was the kind of graveyard of that army in many, many respects. And by the end of the battle, so by those final attacks in November, the first conscripts had arrived on the front line. So the army had changed completely from a volunteer army through to a conscript army. The German army had always been a conscript army, but its pre-war regular forces, highly trained, highly motivated, with a lot of experience. The Somme was the muddy graveyard of those men, so the German army changed as well. And although they still had millions of men to go, the next 2 years of fighting on the Western Front gradually wore that army down to a point where in 1918 they were calling up the class of 1920. So these were 16-year-old lads who were being brought out to the Western Front in that final kind of battle. So the Somme was this kind of turning point. There's a great historian called A.J.P. Taylor. I mean, I saw him talk live. He's been dead for a long time, but he's written a lot of books about both the First and the Second World War. There's some of his programs about leadership in the Second World War on iPlayer again at the moment. And he could stand up and talk about just about anything to do with the First and Second World War without notes for as long as you liked. And he came out with this idea that the 20th century did not begin on the 1st of January 1900. It began on the 1st of July 1916, which was the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And what he meant by that is that day heralded a new type of warfare, industrial warfare, with weapons produced by industry, fed by industry, men supplied with food that came from that same industry, and then casualties on an industrial scale as well. And that would really kind of herald the rest of humanity's experience and much of the rest of the 20th century. So it was the beginning of a new world, really, and a new world that would then continue to unfold over the next few decades.
Yeah, and I assume trench warfare was used in previous battles and wars, but not to such a scale as World War One. And it's a type of warfare I've always been completely fascinated by. I remember looking in the encyclopedia when I was younger, looking kind of like the images of the trenches or like the illustration of the trenches with like the mud and the rats, and it's just again hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah, and I think I mean you can find examples of what you call trench warfare in Roman history. So it's been there for as long as there's been warfare, and it's happening right now on the other side of Europe in Ukraine.
Yeah.
It's not something that I don't think is ever going to go away, and it has its own unique aspects. But in terms of the First War, the scale of it, 450 miles from the Belgian coast down to the Swiss border, and then within that, all those different lines of trenches on both sides. It's tens of thousands of miles of trench systems, and I think it'd probably be impossible to work out exactly how many miles of trench systems it was, but it was some staggering amount, with millions of men on both sides kind of locked into these trenches, living, as we've said, very close together over long, long periods of time. I mean, the author, Robert Graves, went to a part of the front in 1915 and bet that it wouldn't move for years, and this was proved correct. The line there was established in October 1914 and didn't move again until April 1918.
Yeah. And it makes me think and be curious about the fact that there seemed to be much less trench warfare in World War II. Is that because Blitzkrieg, the Nazis' tactic of speed, the development of technology, capturing places like France so quickly? What are the reasons why trench warfare wasn't at such a large scale in World War II compared to World War One?
I think the change in technology and the development of armoured fighting vehicles and tanks created war of movement in a way that wasn't possible in the First World War. So, I mean, certainly every unit that on the Allied side that was preparing during the phony war of 39-40 was preparing for a First World War style battle, whether that was within the Maginot Line where the French army were, or if you're in the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, they dug a whole trench system along the Belgian border and built blockhouses in what was called the Gort Line. the German Blitzkrieg, the German advance in 1940 was a classic war of movement. It was the Schlieffen Plan Mark II in many respects, perhaps the Schlieffen Plan that was actually executed properly on this occasion, which enabled that German victory. And, I mean, that's possibly a discussion for another day, but what it created was a different type of warfare. But although there were many wars and battles, many battles and campaigns of maneuver in the Second World War, there was still static warfare. At Anzio in 1944, my father fought there, and his father had been at Gallipoli in 1915, and he found himself in a trench system at Anzio because they landed on a beach. The Germans blocked their route of advance to Rome, and they dug in, and it was just like the First World War, and the same on the craggy hilltops opposite Monte Cassino and places like this. That was just like the First World War. So there were parts of many battlefields, both east and west within Europe, where trench systems were a massive, massive part of it.
Out of all the podcasts that have made one episode, 90% of them haven't made it past the first episode. There's probably millions of people that have started a podcast, and I have the entire blueprint for you to go from a nobody with no podcast experience like I was to a podcaster with a big show, a growing show that is going sustainably and you're loving every second of it. And out of the 10% of podcasts that make it past the first episode, 90% of those don't make it past episode 20. The bar is not high to become a successful podcaster today. Everyone says, oh, it's oversaturated and stuff like that. And it's just not, because 99% of people that are starting a podcast haven't even started one or made it past episode 1 or 20. I know that you want to start one, and I know that you want to continue one. So if you're actually passionate about this and you really want to take this seriously, click the link in the description, and also just start the podcast with the resources you have right now. What did you feel like when you first walked the Somme?
Well, I mean, that's a long time ago now. It's 40 odd years ago. I mean, it was something that kind of been on my consciousness, really, I think, for quite some time. I grew up with a grandmother who was a young girl during the First World War and could remember soldiers coming back to Colchester in Essex to the military hospitals there, covered in Somme mud. And both my grandfathers had been in the Great War, uncles. I mean, it was kind of always there, really. So when I finally got to walk that landscape, it kind of felt as if quite a few different layers of my life came together, and I've been walking it ever since.
Brilliant. And for those unfamiliar with your incredible work, what do you do and what kind of inspired you to dedicate your life to World War I? You've mentioned kind of family, history and heritage. Was that a big influence on you?
It was, yeah. I mean, I think for most people, you start with a family connection to a subject like the First World War. But I kind of always felt that there was something a little bit more to it. And I followed a traditional route, school, and went to university and did history and geography, and then did a kind of proper job for a little while. But I always knew that I wanted to do something more with this subject. So I got to a point in the job that I was doing that I could kind of jack it in, finish it, and walk away from it, which is what I did, and then went over to France with the idea of being there for 3 months or something like that, to write a book about the landscape of the Somme and the battlefields of the Somme. And I ended up being there over 10 years. So it was that was the moment, I think, that I kind of moved into a different realm, really, with this interest. And from there, that led me to do battlefield tours, which I've been guiding now for 27, 28 years for one particular company in the UK. And then also eventually kind of walking into that pathway, which would take me to do television work, which I did for a very, very long time, working in front of the camera as a contributor to programs, and then a lot behind the camera as well, making documentaries about both the First and the Second World War. In particular, a lot of stuff to do with battlefield archaeology, which were programs amongst some of the earliest programs really to cover that subject.
Could you explain to me what battlefield archaeology actually is?
Well, I mean, when we started filming it, it was called battlefield archaeology. Now it's become a proper kind of study and part of academia. I mean, the professional archaeologists do it, and it's conflict archaeology now, because it's not just restricted to the subject of the First World War. And those kind of skills, have all kinds of modern applications in terms of forensic science and things like that. But battlefield archaeology then was fairly primitive. I mean, there was only a handful of kind of amateur groups that were doing it in the late 90s and early 2000s. And in Belgium, there was a group called the Diggers, and they were a bunch of guys that had metal detectors. They had the permission of a landowner to search a site just outside the city of Ypres in Flanders in Belgium, where there'd been front lines for most of the First World War. And the land had been left pretty much since 1918. It was just pasture land. But they were going to build a massive, great big complex on it of factories and store units and just about everything else. And these guys got permission to work one step ahead of that to see what was there. And I remember at the time, a lot of people believed that the landscape of the First World War had been cleared up after that conflict, that all the stuff that was to be found had been found or dumped or destroyed. But what these guys proved was that was far from the truth, because as soon as they started peeling back that landscape and that soil, the whole history of the First World War came to light through this work.
And what kind of things did they discover? Would it be like, old guns, soldiers' uniforms? Like what understanding did the finds and discoveries give historians which they didn't have before?
I mean, I think, if you look at the First World War, it's 110 years ago now. Then, 20 odd years ago, it wasn't even at its century since its conflict. And this is a period which is heavily written about. I mean, there's a huge amount of written material. Some veterans of the First World War were still alive then. And you kind of might think, well, everything is known. But what that type of archaeology proved is that actually not everything was known, because while there's a manual of trench warfare, let's say, which tells you how to dig a trench and the dimensions of a trench and where the fire step would be and where this and that would be, what the diggers actually found was that there was lots of field modifications done by soldiers based on the problems and the conditions in the landscape in which they were working. Because, they did find a lot of weaponry and a lot of soldiers' equipment. They found fragments of uniforms, greatcoats, and also quite a lot of human remains as well, because it was discovered that not every soldier had been recovered from these Flanders fields in this case. But peeling back the landscape, it kind of revealed the trench system, and there it was, these zigzag crenellations of trenches and forward bays for sniping, observation, machine gun positions, even trench toilets, that kind of thing. It was all kind of there. And then dugout entrances, and they got into quite a few dugout systems, including the big Yorkshire dugout, which is still there to this day. You can't go in it, but you can see the entrances to it. And I think this told us a lot about what actually went on. Soldiers are taught one thing at a base or back in Britain, but on the front line, they practice a very different kind of methodology. And the archaeology is the only way of kind of revealing that, really. And I think it was the kind of preservation of some of this stuff as well was just incredible.
Mm. And you made the decision to live in the Somme for quite some time. And how has that daily, intimate connection with the battlefield changed your understanding of the war?
Oh, it changed it massively, I think, because I was living in the space of the First World War. It was everywhere. There's a modern landscape there today in which people go about their lives, many of them pretty much oblivious to what really happened there in the First World War. Not that they should be, but it's on their doorstep. But if you are kind of connected to that wavelength of the First World War, living in it changes your perspective forever. So, right throughout the course of a year, with the different seasons and different weather and activity on that landscape, which, I would see not just a few times a year, but every single day, you began to understand a lot more in terms of how the landscape affects the conflict, how it affects fighting, and what the landscape can tell us today. I mean, there's this idea that the landscape is one of the last witnesses, or perhaps the last witness of the First World War, in that it's still got all these secrets that it kind of gives away to us every time we peel it back through archaeology, through modern work to build roads or factories or housing estates or kind of whatever it is. And the First World War literally became part of my daily life, really, in terms of even going to the shops, you pass cemeteries and you see things going on. You see farmers in fields digging away at something, and people used to knock on my door. I mean, one night I was sitting there was a knock on the door. A local farmer had been doing some work at where the back of the house was in this village, Courcelette, which had been a main Canadian battlefield of the First World War. And something like 8,500 Canadians were killed there, and 6,000 or more are still missing.
Wow.
And this guy is standing there, something like 8 o'clock at night, with a steel helmet in his hand, with a skull in it. And he's found the remains of a First World War soldier there, that they're pulled by accident out of a bank, and he's coming to me to say, you need to do something about this. Now, today the practice would be very different, but in those days there was what was called a chief exhumations officer of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, who I knew. So I called him, and he said, well, retrieve what you can before they do any more damage, and we'll come down properly tomorrow. And so I retrieved, what remained of this soldier, who'd been wounded very badly. He'd lost an arm and lost a leg, had removed his tunic. There was enough on it to identify him as a Canadian soldier, but nothing to identify him personally in terms of who he was. And I recovered those remains, and they stayed in our house overnight until the War Graves Commission came to get them the next day. And I often say that he was probably the most honoured guest that we ever had to stay, really, because he was someone's son, he was someone's perhaps brother, or who knows what his story was. So it's kind of things like that, really, that I just, couldn't and didn't want to escape the First World War. And it was there literally every day.
Did it feel surreal having someone from, almost probably 100 years ago, a Canadian soldier who was missing in action and their families never got to know whether he was alive or where he died? What was that feeling? What feeling did you have having him as a guest overnight?
It's a very powerful feeling because, you're honoured to kind of be in that situation. It's not something that most people will ever experience for all kinds of understandable reasons. And it makes you think about, who he was, what was his story, where he'd come from. 70% of the original Canadians who fought in the First World War were born in Great Britain. And, was he one of them? Was he one of those who went to Canada before the First World War, as many did, to try and find his fame and his fortune? There were all these popular novels about gold panning in Canada, where young men went there and they panned a river somewhere and pulled out a golden nugget as big as their head. But the reality was that they weren't finding anything in most of these places. And although Canada would pay for you to come to the country to kind of set up business or work on farms or whatever it wasn't going to pay you to send you back home again. So a lot of men kind of found themselves stuck there. One of the veterans that I interviewed, Lance Catamol, he was very much in this kind of this position because he'd gone there with his brothers in the 1910s when he was only 13, 14 years old, and they thought they were going to come back and live this life of luxury, that having gained all these riches in Canada, but it wasn't like that. And then the war came along, and they saw it as an opportunity to enlist and come home, because everyone said the war was going to be over by Christmas, but that wasn't the truth. And he eventually found himself in the village where I lived. I interviewed him long before I lived there, but he ended up at Courcelette, fighting there on the first Canadian attack and the first use of tanks in September 1916. So he was kind of typical of many of the men that came in. And I thought of him when I had this lad, to stay for the night. But somewhere, and sadly, because of the fact so many of these men have nothing on them to say who they are, a nationality and sometimes perhaps a regiment or something like that, you don't know, you don't discover who they are. And in those days, there was no DNA testing, because that really was technology that had not really been refined or even existed at that point. So there was no chance of uncovering exactly who he was. So I'd never know that story. It's kind of, something that you could muse over endlessly as to what had brought him to that point where he was fighting and dying on the Somme in 1916.
It must have felt surreal, but it also kind of paradoxically feels real in the sense that you actually have someone who's fought in that war and who's died in that war with you for a night. And for me personally, I mean, I find it incredibly hard to comprehend that World War One and World War Two and other battles like that and other wars like that actually happened. It's just so hard for my mind to wrap around the amount of people that have died. So I mean, having real like evidence of that and experiencing that firsthand must have made you kind of, like you said, feel extremely. It made it feel extremely powerful for you.
Definitely as well. And, I think a subject like the First World War, when you look at it, I mean, there's huge amounts of statistics with these mind-boggling figures about how many people were killed, wounded, and what the loss was globally, millions of people. And it's difficult to really imagine what that is.
Yeah, yeah,
And then you're presented with the remains of a First World War soldier, and it becomes suddenly very personal. And I think that you can kind of get a better sense of that loss and the proportion of that loss and the effect of that loss by being involved in something like that. And sadly for him, he was robbed of his identity by the means of his death in 1916. And even with modern science, it wasn't possible. But he was buried with full military honours in the local, one of 3 local military cemeteries, where a lot of his comrades from the Canadian Army were also buried. So it wasn't that he was kind of left in the cold, far from
yeah.
it. He was honoured and buried properly, which is one of the incredible things that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission still do to this day.
It's very important to do that. You mentioned interviewing veterans, and
Mm.
if I'm correct, you've interviewed hundreds of
Yeah.
World War One veterans, which is very lucky, especially because it was over 110 years ago. And how these first-hand accounts changed and improved your understanding of World War One, and what do these conversations teach you that maybe World War One books and historians couldn't?
Well, I mean, I was kind of in the right place at the right time. I grew up in Sussex, and I went to university, the University of Chichester, and that's on the south coast where there's a lot of retirement areas. And I got inspired really to kind of begin to interview First World War veterans with books like Martin Middlebrook and Lynn MacDonald. And Martin Middlebrook was very good because in the back of his book, he listed every veteran that he interviewed and for some reason, where they lived in Britain at the time he interviewed them. And in those days, I know it's hard to imagine a life before the internet, but you could go into a local library and the phone books
Yeah.
were on the shelves. So I could get this list of guys that were living in Sussex, go to the local library, look them up, and see if they had a phone number. And very few people were ex-directory in those days. So I used to ring these guys up and say, are you Mr. Brown who served with the 2nd Middlesex in Mash Valley on the first day of the Somme? And he'd say, I am. And we'd kind of go from there. And I ended up interviewing, over 350 of these guys, and many of them in care homes. I mean, I rang a few care homes up and said, have you got any First World War veterans? And I remember one of them saying, how many do you want? So, and they had, I think, well over a dozen or so at that point. And I went to interview, I went to interview all of them. And I think what you get from it is incredibly variable because everybody's experience of war is different. And if you're going there to try and understand the, kind of big scheme, big picture, arrows on a map kind of thing, you're not going to get that generally from an ordinary soldier or even from somebody that served as an officer in an infantry battalion or an artillery unit. But if you're going there to understand what the experience of war was for ordinary men and women, then that's what you're going to take away from it. Because memory can deceive people. They can kind of remember certain elements in a different way. But what I found with a lot of these guys is that because they kept it bottled up for so long, that if someone came along and asked the right questions in the right way, it would be like a cork out of a bottle, and all this kind of stuff would just come tumbling out. And I found that mostly they were pretty accurate with how they kind of looked at the time frame of it and events in their little square footage of Flanders or the Somme or the Hindenburg Line or whatever it was. But more than that, I think it was that experience of war which really was drummed home by talking to those men. And again, I was incredibly privileged to be able to do that.
And what was, I mean, like you said, it varies, but if you could if you've got a kind of general view of what the soldiers, a lot of them maybe repeated, what their experiences were like. What was that kind of overall feeling, and how did it kind of, maybe vary with age and also experience on the battlefield? How did it progress over the course of the battle? Did they become more fearful or less fearful? Was it really like enjoyable, or was it horrific, or was it all of them combined?
I think with any experience of conflict, it's kind of a bit of all of those things. I mean, I think I was watching a video the other day produced by AI, which kind of showed First World War soldiers in the trenches and kind of telling their tale. And it's what most people kind of think the First World War is, this terrible war, which they were all miserable all the time and hungry and crying and wishing they were home and so on. I mean, the men that I interviewed did not think like that at all. They were very
Really?
proud of the service that they'd done, and proud of the regiments and units that they'd served with, and proud of their achievement. I think that the sense that Britain and the Commonwealth and France and America had a victory in 1918 is kind of lost perhaps in the mists of time, overshadowed as it was, of course, by a second Great War, the Second World War, and the pathway to that war, of course, connected to the first one. But these were men who never, none of them ever said that they regretted having served. Far from it. I mean, a lot of them used to say to me, "I wish I was back there now." And although they had privations like poor food occasionally and all this kind of stuff, these were young men who were keen to be doing their bit, and that sense of duty that they had is something I think that a lot of modern people really struggle to understand. These men, they had a code. They felt that things were important, and standing up for who they were and the country they'd been born in and the things that that country then stood for, to them was quite important. And they didn't like bullies, and they saw Germany as a bully who'd stamped its way across lands over which he had no dominion, like Belgium and of course subsequently France as well. So they wanted to put that right, and they were, pleased that they had an opportunity to do that. And like I say, I mean, they lost friends, and they were all affected by it. They didn't have words like PTSD or things like that. Every single veteran that I interviewed who'd seen combat certainly was affected by it, whether they could verbalize that or not, but they were affected by it for the rest of their life. But the kind of things they would say was, there was one I used to go and see, and he'd say, "I fought the Battle of the Somme in my bed again last night." And that was his kind of very quiet kind of nod to the fact that the war still remained with him, really.
Wow, that's really kind of powerful, just to think that obviously, yeah, they didn't really explain, or they didn't know what PTSD was, but like you're replaying it in your mind, even if you, like you said, thought it was worth it and you'd go back, like you're still gonna have trauma from that. You're still gonna be replaying that in your mind. Could you tell me a bit more about your dad's experience or your father's experience in the Italian campaign? How much did he open up to you about his experiences?
Well, I think I must have been the worst kind of son for him, really, because he's a veteran. He doesn't really want to talk about it. And I endlessly questioned him about the Second World War, from the second that I could, really. And he was very good and patient with it all and so on. But he spoke, when I was younger, he told me a lot of funny stories, and he spoke a lot about the kit that they'd captured, from, machine guns and rifles through to Kettengrads, these kind of motorcycle half-track things they rode around on and so on. But as he got older, and as I had children who then questioned him, he kind of opened up a lot more. And I got him to write down a lot of his experiences at Anzio. And he was nearly killed 3 times in the Second World War. One at Anzio when their observation post got hit, and he was on the way out, and the new team had just moved in, and the new team got hit, and they were pretty much all killed. There's a row of them at Anzio War Cemetery. And then another occasion, he jumped off because they were a mobile artillery unit he was in, and he was in the battery commander's tank, which is a Sherman tank with radio sets in the turret and no proper gun. It was a wooden barrel, dummy barrel. The only weapon there was a machine gun. And they pulled up somewhere near Rimini, and while they were advancing on the Gothic line. And my dad was a good scrounger, so he was always looking for bits of wood to make a fire to brew some tea. And he jumped off the back of the tank into some grass, and unbeknownst to him, there was a plank with a nail in it. He went from the height of a Sherman tank straight down onto a rusty nail, which nearly resulted in his leg being amputated and in nearly him dying of blood poisoning. So that was number 2. And then the third time was in the last week of the war in Italy, when his battery commander was still looking to get the military cross for, because he was kind of obsessed with that. And they were going along the banks of the River Po, and a German tank pulled out and fired at them a bit too quickly. So the shell hit the gun mantle of the Sherman and bounced off. It was probably the thickest bit of the armour at that particular point, and turned the tank turret into a bell, and all the radio sets exploded, and their blood coming out their ears and eyes and noses and everything else. And they managed to, the driver popped a bit of smoke and they got away, but that they nearly didn't get away. So, you know, he was lucky to survive those three occasions, and then he came back from the war and lived a normal life. He had he wanted to be a musician in the 50s, but there wasn't much kind of money in that, and he ended up working for an American company called Duracell that made Mallory batteries, and he got back to Italy, Rimini, because of that work a couple of times, but he could never go back to Anzio. In 1979, he actually booked a trip for me and him to go to Anzio, and he chickened out. I found out many years later he chickened out at the last minute because he couldn't do it. So instead, he took me to Normandy, and that kind of launched me on another kind of route, really. So I'm forever grateful for that.
Yeah. Again, it's almost that randomness, and just by chance, luckily, he survives, and that's obviously going to have a psychological toll on you in hindsight.
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is something that I think is quite interesting, is this idea of inherited trauma. So, you can have parents that went through things like a world war, and they come back with trauma, and they can pass it onto their children. I mean, I like to kind of think I'm a fairly rounded kind of individual, but when I look back on some of his behaviours as a human being, I can see that they're shaped by his experience in conflict in the world that he'd grown up in, which I guess is true of everyone. But I think it's perhaps more intense during a particular kind of pivotal period like the Second World War.
Definitely, and it is to an extent understandable, especially, I guess, maybe not as bad as World War One, but them generations weren't known for opening up. You said he opened up more when he was older, but imagine having all of that trauma bottled up inside of you and replaying it every night and not feeling like you're able to talk about it.
Well, I mean, kind of what I found, having, like I said, having interviewed, I honestly don't know how many Second World War veterans. It's well over 1,000. And many of those are guys that have travelled with me to battlefields. And they're very similar to the First World War veterans in that they kind of locked it away, and they got to a certain age, and then it had to come out. And again, I was kind of, I don't know whether I was lucky or they were lucky or however we're going to look at it, but somebody came along and was able to kind of speak that language and get them to talk about it. And I remember going to Italy with a group to Monte Cassino and the battlefields there. And there was a guy who'd served in the Lancashire Fusiliers, and he was there with his wife and his daughter and her husband. And they all said he won't talk about it. He never talks about it. He will won't get a word out of him. And I sat down with him on one of the days, and we had a little chat, and he didn't stop talking after that. And his whole war came out, and it was very, very interesting. I mean, he became a painter and decorator after the war because he felt it was a fairly mundane kind of job. No disrespect to people that paint and decorate, but he kind of felt that he could get lost in that, and it was quite good for his mental health. And that was great up until he retired. He worked, I think, beyond retirement age. But then eventually, when he wasn't working anymore, the kind of ghosts of the war began to creep in, to the point where he decides to come on a trip to go back to those battlefields. And his family really didn't understand what lay behind that, because they didn't understand the kind of ghosts that he was laying when he went there, really.
And how do you open up them people? What are some techniques that you've found useful for you asking the right questions? Like, is it kind of intuitive, or there's some purposeful techniques?
I think you've got to kind of sense the kind of person, and I think they've got to feel comfortable that you're not going to say, right, come on, granddad, tell me how many people you bayoneted. Because all of them had been asked questions like that. I mean, some of them in the 60s, when it was a very kind of anti-war period, were asked how many children they killed in the war and things like that, you know. So society changes, and but these guys feel further and further often away from that society because of the gulf between soldier and civilian, which is massive, really. I guess because having grown up with a father who was a veteran and be surrounded by these people from an early age, I kind of understood their mentality and to a degree their phraseology. So we'd kind of joke about a few things, and then, you know, you chuck a few kind of army words in there and they kind of think this is someone who knows a little bit more than the average person. And I would never start with the war with them, never. Even when I'd set up a formal interview, I wouldn't start with, right, come on, tell me what it was like to go over the top on the first day of the Somme, or, you know, storm up a D-Day beach. We'd go back to their childhood and start with that. And who was your parents? You know, where did you grow up? You know, what did they do? And often they were quite surprised by that. But it kind of relaxed them. It took them back to that time. And there was a much more kind of smooth transition from that period of their life into talking about the war, because also kind of understood them a little bit more as well as human beings. And I think that's really important. You know, a soldier is a soldier, but he is also a human being at the same time, and to understand where he's come from and those kind of elements of his life is important as well. And I kind of always, I let them do the talking, really. I wouldn't push them about things. And there were some that I realized that would talk on one level and probably would not go beyond that. But there were others that I felt that they kind of wanted to say a little bit more. So they were the ones that I would go back to. And I would then spend more time with them and talk about things. And gradually these kind of stories would come out. And, you know, again, I've been very lucky all my life. I've spent, you know, all these decades with two generations of men who went to war in some of the toughest battles of the 20th century and through some of the hardest times. And they're a great inspiration to have, because they're people that they believed in something. And they're, you know, in terms of, I will never meet anyone as big or as great or as incredible as those people were, because they were, you know, the rock of their foundation was formed by the experience of those conflicts. And the modern world isn't really like that, I don't think.
Yeah, and it's scary to think that it could be like that in the future, and also scary to think that if it happens anytime soon, it might be me in a similar situation. And you just think, how can someone so young, like you were saying about the 16-year-olds, how can someone who's not even got their driver's license or can't even drink alcohol, killing people, killing other basically children or other teenagers? It's just so hard to wrap your head around. And yeah, you're in a very lucky position to have been able to interview those people. Very.
It is, and I think that, you know, I don't think we ever do learn from history, but history does offer us up lessons if we choose to listen to them. But I don't think we ever really do. But I mean, I remember Alf Rosell. He was a veteran of the Royal Fusiliers who fought on the Somme. Incredible man in all kinds of ways, and he said, you know, wars always end with men sitting around a table and having some kind of discussion. And that's what brings that conflict to an end. It's not always the fighting, it's the discussion. He said, why can't they have that discussion in the first place? And all those guys, they don't have to die. And, you know, for a man who'd been through a battle like the Somme, and he was captured at Arras the following year, you can kind of see this. Conflict is a terrible thing. But there are times, and he would be the first to say this, and certainly those men I interviewed who were in the Second World War, my dad amongst them, would say it too. There's a time when a man has to stand up, and, you know, men and women have to stand up against an injustice. And there are many injustices in this world that can only be silenced, sadly, by conflict. But, you know, there are times ahead, I suspect, for this world in which conflict will return. Who knows? You know, I mean, if we could predict the future, we'd be living very different lives, I suspect. But if you look at recent history, when young people of your kind of age have gone to war, serving with British Armed Forces in Afghanistan and Iraq, we've kind of seen just as much a willingness of young people to do that. But whether they should have to, that's, I guess, a decision that politicians need to make.
And I think we would have to do another episode if we want to talk about World War II. So I'd be excited to do that in the future.
Sure.
But could you tell me a bit about D-Day specifically? Because you said visiting Normandy really opened your eyes to a whole new obsession, and D-Day's something I've always been obsessed with. How does the veterans' account of D-Day differ from Omaha Beach in Saving Private Ryan?
Well, I mean, the American experience of D-Day was different to the British and different to the Canadian experience and to the French commandos who landed on Sword Beach. Hollywood there's nothing wrong with Saving Private Ryan. I mean, what it depicts happened. The Americans walked into an incredible amount of firepower on Omaha Beach and took a hell of a lot of casualties. The bunkers look very different to the Hollywood bunkers. Actually, they were disguised in the bluffs and the cliff faces there, not these great big kind of concrete structures that we see dominating the beach in Private Ryan. But yeah, I mean, when I went into Normandy, I mean, I kind of grew up on World War II films and with airfix kits of Tiger tanks and Spitfires and all that kind of stuff, and and war comics, and it was just kind of everywhere really, and things like The Longest Day, and then getting a chance to go there and actually kind of seeing these battlefields, again, a bit like the First World War, it kind of opened up a new kind of angle of it. And the first time I went to Normandy, I was sitting outside the Gondry Cafe at Pegasus Bridge, which is the first building liberated in France in 1944, and where glider force landed right by the bridge to capture it. And you've got to remember, this is, again, pre-internet days. I'd read a few books, and I knew what guys looked like perhaps during the war. But, my dad didn't look like he'd looked in 1944, 45 when he was in Italy. So I was there with my dad. We were sitting at this table having a hot chocolate outside this cafe, and there was another old guy sitting on the next table who we could see by the way he was dressed wasn't French, he was British. So my dad kind of nodded to him and said, you're a veteran? And he said, yes. He said, where did you serve? And he said, here. And so my dad said, well, yeah, I guess you probably served in Normandy, but I kind of thought, where did you serve? And he said, no, you don't understand. I served here. My name is John Howard, and my men captured this bridge in the early hours of D-Day in 1944. So on my first trip, I got to meet the then Major John Howard, who was awarded a DSO for that action, for leading the Ox and Bucks glider troops across the bridge and capturing that position. So that kind of, opened up a new chapter. And the men who I've taken back to D-Day beaches will tell the same story, that they were coming in, they're highly trained. They spend, some cases, well over a year training for that specific operation. And the ramp goes down, they go forward, and they go into action. And depending on the beach, every beach had casualties. I mean, Omaha wasn't the only one where people got mown down by fire. Sword Beach, I used to take a chap called Bert Barrett back to Normandy. He'd served with the 2nd East Yorks, and he was in the follow-up wave, so which is probably how he survived, because his battalion went in and took a hell of a pasting on Sword Beach. And later on, he went forward as a reinforcement. He was what was called LOB, left out of battle. And he was picking his way over the corpses of the guys who'd been killed in the first phase of the landing. There was knocked out tanks everywhere. It had been a hell of a battle, because on most, in fact, all D-Day beaches, apart from Utah, where they landed in the wrong place, the German defences were pretty much intact. And the men who landed had to fight their way through them and over them. And that cost quite a lot of casualties. And in certain beaches, Sword Beach is a good example of it, the momentum broke down because of that. And the timetable of pushing inland, getting nearer to Caen and all that kind of stuff, that broke down as well. And in the American sector, they face different challenges. When you look at the British and Canadian beaches, they're angled beaches that go up to a road system where there's often buildings. And although there can be sloping ground beyond them, such as on Gold Beach, it's nothing like the high bluffs of Omaha. Omaha is a defender's paradise with incredible views down onto the beach. staggering kind of fields of fire. So, if you've got enough ammunition and weapons and teams of men to defend it, even if they're not very well trained and have got poor morale, which was the case with a lot of German units on D-Day, they can inflict very heavy losses. But it was I think on Omaha Beach, it wasn't one battle, it was 1,000 different battles where groups of men got chopped up by fire, as much mortar and artillery fire as machine gun fire. Because when you visit Normandy today and you go up onto the bluffs above Omaha and you go back a little bit, you come across the Tobruk pits that were built not for machine guns but for mortars, and you come across the observation posts that are up there that they could use to direct fire, and inland were heavy mortars, artillery, and all kinds of stuff. So, I think one author, Stephen Zaloga, calls it the Devil's Garden, with the amount of kind of ordnance that they had that they could chuck at that beach. And all of that kind of factored into the casualties. But in those kind of 1,000 different battles of American troops, it's a testimony to their bravery and training that they were able to, small groups of men could find a way to get their path through that minefield, over that barbed wire fence, into that German strong point, and fight their way off the beach and get up the bluffs. And gradually you see little isolated battles being connected up and the whole kind of defensive line collapse. So, it was a terrible day for America. And that was its costliest D-Day beach. Whether it was the most costliest D-Day beach of the whole Allied landing, I'm sure historians will still be discussing for a long time to come. But the ability of those troops that landed there, their training and their bravery, meant that there was ultimately victory. And although they didn't get as far inland on day one as they'd hoped, they did get off those beaches. And over the days that followed, the beachhead was exploited and the Allies pushed in. 156,000 men landed on D-Day, and really only a minority of them became casualties, whereas Churchill had not slept for days in the approach to Normandy, thinking that the sea was going to run red with the blood of Allied men who'd been killed there.
Was it Eisenhower who had an apology letter in his pocket because he was so pessimistic about the result of what D-Day could have been?
I'm sure he wasn't the only one. It was, on one level, you could say it was a hell of a gamble, but on the other, when you look at it closely, the amount of preparation with almost every scenario being played out and thought over, and the kit being adapted to get through minefields, to get over seawalls, to take out bunkers, to get up bluffs, to construct roads, and it just kind of went on. And I think all of that, it's probably the most planned, one of the most planned, not over-planned, but certainly planned operations of the Second World War in terms of, of an Allied operation. And that planning, which in some cases went back considerable amounts of time, was what paid dividends. Everything from the weather to sand samples to the way they used pre-war postcards of seaside resorts to work out what they looked like and which was the best beaches to land on and stuff. It's just staggering.
Yeah. And why did they choose Omaha? You mentioned Howe's Devil's Garden and the Bluffs. Why would they choose that beach?
Well, if you look at how they landed, so there were 3 British and Canadian beaches, 2 British, 1 Canadian. One of the British beaches also had French commandos on it as well, and their task was part of the kind of wider commando special service brigade to advance inland, take out the port of Worcester and so on. But they landed in a specific area, and their task was to land in the British sector and then move inland to the road systems and advance on Bayeux and Caen, and then contain the German army in that area, fight the German army, and allow the Allies to build up. Because for the first month of the operation, in fact, there were more British and Canadian soldiers in Normandy than Americans, because the Americans had to build up forces to allow their breakout. Now, their philosophy, following the initial landings, was to go up the Carentan Peninsula, the Cotentin Peninsula, via Carentan, up into that ground towards Cherbourg, and to take the deep water port of Cherbourg so they could supply direct across the Atlantic. So to do that, they had to land men on that peninsula, which was Utah Beach, and they had to land a supporting force to basically guarantee the base of that peninsula and to stop the Germans from attacking into it. And they needed a beach to do that. And the coastline between the British sector and where Omaha Beach was, Omaha was the only area that you could carry out a landing. So there was no other place to do it. So it was either there or not. And you needed to land there. So it was considered an acceptable sacrifice. And if you look at the American army in 1944 that came to Europe, it had fought in some previous battles in other theatres of war, but not on the same scale as the US Marine Corps in the Pacific and so on. And I think there was a kind of feeling amongst some American commanders that they had almost infinite amounts of men, that it didn't matter if you threw 100,000 men at the Atlantic Wall and 99,000 were killed. You had 500,000 sitting in Pennsylvania and another 300,000 in North Dakota and, and so on. And you could just bring them over to replace them, which was very different to the British approach, where by 1944, which was our 5th year of war, we had a massive manpower problem and we couldn't afford just to throw men away, which is why we invested so much in combat technology and planning.
Yeah. Going back a bit, you mentioned in World War One, what's it called? Courcelette? Is that the place? Yeah, and you were talking about the Canadians' effort in World War One, which is often overlooked. Could you tell me more about the victory at Courcelette and why is it largely forgotten amongst many historians and accounts of the First World War?
Well, I mean, it's the first time the Canadian Corps, which had been formed from 4 separate Canadian divisions, so men drawn from every part of Canada, they'd formed it into a corps under a British commander, Julian Byng, and it served holding the line up in Flanders and then moved down to the Somme for its first offensive. And it was an important turning point in Canadian military history in the 20th century because this would be the first time Canada as a nation had attacked in Europe and would liberate a French village, which would become a very kind of familiar thing going forward in the rest of the First World War, and then significantly in the liberation of D-Day onwards through Europe in 1944-45. And it was the first time that Canada had kind of brought its forces together to fight like this. It wasn't an entirely successful battle for Canada, but it helped them learn lessons from trench warfare that were then applied to later fighting. And Byng went on to command the Canadians at Vimy Ridge the following year in April 1917, when the Corps captured the whole of Vimy Ridge on the northern part of the Arras battlefields in 5 days. At some cost, 10,000 casualties, but its achievement in doing that, I think, was paved by his experiences on the Somme. And Canada kind of remembers Vimy, is kind of obsessed with Vimy because it was where its big national monument was built after the First World War. But it forgets not just Courcelette, but actions like Courcelette, where the Canadians paid a high price, but also played a major role in kind of forging a new type of warfare and also taking the battle forward to the enemy. So it's a significant moment in Canada's history. And it's also one of the most costliest battlefields, 8,500 dead, of which over 6,000 are missing. So the Vimy Memorial, which many Canadians visit, 50% of the names on there are men killed at Courcelette. So it's kind of one of those, I hate to use that word forgotten because it's kind of overused by the media, but it's kind of certainly a lesser known Canadian battle of the First World War.
Yeah, and it's really good that you're sharing it and have mentioned it many times, because I haven't obviously studied World War One as extensively as you have, and I have studied more World War Two, but I had no idea about that contribution and that battle. So thank you for enlightening me on that. From studying various conflicts, do any patterns emerge that lead to a large-scale war? And are there any common mistakes that humans do or generals do that lead to their downfall in wars?
I mean, that's quite a question. I mean, there are lucky generals, there are unlucky generals. Every general's made a mistake on every battlefield, really. I mean, there isn't a general alive or dead that hasn't or won't make a mistake at some point or other. So, I mean, warfare, it can be a difficult thing. Many generals in the First World War went to war in 1914, as I said, kind of prepared for war, thinking they were prepared for war, but the war that they were prepared for didn't really exist beyond those kind of fleeting moments at the very beginning of that conflict, and they had to learn a very new type of warfare. And even in the Second World War, you'd think that, given the experience of the British Army that went to war in 1939 would be kind of super prepared for the next conflict. It wasn't. It had kind of forgotten the lessons of the previous conflict and the previous war, and it had done kind of nothing to address that over the next 2 decades. And the BEF in 1939-40 that had to stem the blitzkrieg, the German offensive in the Battle of France, was ill prepared for it, and its generals had a mentality again of kind of fighting a previous war. And not many of them, some of them did, but not many of them really truly survived. I mean, Monty was a divisional commander in 1940 and learned the lessons of divisional command and kind of what not to do. And the British Army changed dramatically following Dunkirk because it had to, because it couldn't afford to keep fighting battles, campaigns like that. So, I'm sure there are many generals in recent conflicts that were convinced that the war was going to go their way because of this, that, and the other. But war isn't like that. It's not a completely predictable beast, and things happen in ways that you could never really anticipate. And there's an old military adage that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And, that's true in every war that's ever been fought.
Yeah. And again, from the limited battles I've studied and historical wars and stuff like that, I kind of seem to notice a pattern of overconfidence. I sometimes describe it as almost stubborn ignorance. So maybe an example of that would be Hitler in the Eastern Front deciding to break off his troops and not go towards Moscow, or maybe Chamberlain underestimating the Nazis and thinking we could be at peace with them. Is that something you've noticed as well in your studies?
I mean, no one's going to reach the rank of high command or be, the leader of a nation by being a shrinking violet and hiding under a blanket somewhere. So, I mean, people with that level of confidence often can be overconfident in things that they do. And thank God that people like Hitler were, because the outcome of history could have been very different if their predictions and if their mindset had been correct. So I think it's an interesting element to it, but I think that the kind of high command level in terms of decision making is one that is often difficult to quantify, and I think there are so many factors at play with it that commanders, the ones that come out favourably are the ones that will be the eventual victors. And, we see this in the Allied story of Italy in the Second World War. Mark Clark was hated by pretty much every British soldier that served in Italy. He was the commander of the American Fifth Army, and then later overall Army Group commander of 15 Army Group in Italy. He was hated by most British soldiers, but considered probably to be a genius and a brilliant commander by his own side. And there are some historians now trying to kind of rehabilitate his reputation and cast him as this great commander. I think they'll have quite a job with that, if I'm honest.
Why was he hated? I'm not aware of him.
There was a decision that he made. So when the breakout began in 1944 in Italy, with the breaking of the Gustav line around Cassino and the pushing back of the German forces there, and then Allied troops that had been contained at Anzio were able to break out, he was given strict orders to come round the back of the German forces, cut them off, and hopefully wipe out German forces in Italy and bring that campaign to an end, or certainly have a decisive moment in it. But ahead of him was the prize of Rome, capture of a capital city, and to be the first Allied commander to capture a European capital city. And that was a very tempting prize to someone with his ambition and his kind of ego, and that was the prize that he went for. And it allowed a significant number of German forces to get away and fight another day, and made that campaign in Italy continue right up to the bitter end, and and it would cost the lives of thousands of Allied soldiers. So many British veterans, my dad included, saw him as a kind of a butcher who had prolonged the war in Italy for his own ego. So not a general that they particularly admired.
Yeah, and again, kind of that ego and overconfidence can hinder you. And do you think World War One veterans would have thought the same about Churchill due to the Dardanelles campaign, the mistakes that he made? I mean, I've read a few biographies on him, and there's different opinions about that. But a lot of the biographer that I read on Churchill, Paul Johnson, he argues that a lot of the blame was wrongly given to Churchill. But do you think a lot of the World War One veterans had doubts over Churchill when he came into power in World War Two?
Well, I certainly think that I mean Churchill was the architect of the Dardanelles, and those who were there would have known this. I mean, Churchill himself took the blame for it and resigned as a consequence of it. To be fair to him, he took his place on literally the front line by going to France and becoming a battalion commander on the Western Front for a short while before he eventually rejoined the war cabinet. But I think that that was a generation before. There were many that would have had doubts about Churchill, and not just people who blamed him for Gallipoli. There were all kinds of reasons as to why they might have doubts about Churchill. But he was a man of that moment. That's kind of what he proved in the years of conflict. But he was not a man for the peace, which the veterans who were returning from conflict demonstrated by how they voted in the post-war period. They didn't want Churchill. They wanted a new world. That's what they'd fought for. So Churchill had his time, and I guess every commander has their time one way or another.
Do you think in my generation, I've noticed maybe, I think it was during COVID, when there were a lot of protests going on, a lot of people were complaining about Churchill and kind of disrespecting him, and it's kind of, I don't know, maybe indicating that he was racist and stuff like that. And, I don't know what things he said, but I can imagine that his voice was probably the general mindset of that entire generation. And do you think we shouldn't be so disrespectful about someone who stopped us from speaking German and kind of killing millions of ethnic minorities? Do you think it's disrespectful to try and put the ideals of today on the people of 50 to 100 years ago?
I mean, the people in the past are not the same as us. My father couldn't stand Churchill. He fought for Britain in the Second World War, but he couldn't stand Churchill. He couldn't stand for all the things that he stood for. And many veterans would have felt the same, and many veterans would have thought that Churchill was fantastic. I think it's difficult to generalize with something like that. And there's a lot of Churchill is quite a divisive figure in terms of what he did and some of the actions that he took. I wouldn't claim to be an expert on Churchillian history. You kind of need to get a contributor on who could give you a much better kind of a account of that. But he's certainly a man who was there at the moment that he was needed. But interestingly, as I've said, when that moment had come to an end, when that conflict was closing, and that generation that had fought it at the very sharpest end of it returned, they didn't want him. They voted him out.
But didn't he come back after that?
He did, yeah, he did. Probably he shouldn't have come back, but he was a very old man at the end of his life by then, and I'm not sure that was Churchill's finest hour at that moment. But like I say, I'm not a Churchillian historian, but in the terms of the immediate aftermath of the war, he proved to be a good war leader that led the nation at that moment. And but he stood for all kinds of things that many people didn't agree with, but put that to one side because of a wider aspect of what was happening in the Second World War. But when they had a chance to change that government, they changed it.
Yeah. And to end it off, I've got a few more questions. What individual human stories tell us? What do individual human stories tell us that grand strategic narratives cannot?
Well, they're two different things, really. Like I said to you, talking to men and women that experienced conflict, and I spoke to a lot of women that were not necessarily in the forces, but saw the results of sacrifice and the legacy of sacrifice, having to deal with having lost a father or a brother, or in some cases a son, for those that were from the Second World War generation. Those women were as much victims of those two conflicts, as the men that are named on war memorials, because they had to deal with the grief and the outcome of grief and raising families alone and all that kind of stuff. So the kind of history you're going to get from them and those who were at the sharp end of conflict is very different from the kind of understanding of a strategic, operational kind of level of warfare. That's something that, is to delve into the archives and the memoirs of those who commanded. And, that's an element of history that's very, very popular and one that I've studied myself, and because you have to understand the wider picture. But the human experience of war is something that for me will always be far more interesting, because these were ordinary men and women in extraordinary times.
Yeah, and why is it so important to preserve these accounts of the wars? And what can happen if we forget about the horrors, the personal horrors, and the veterans' interviews?
Well, I mean, no nation exists in isolation. It's built on a foundation of something, and the nation that we've known, that I've grown up in, and to a lesser extent that you've grown up in, can trace elements of what it is and how it is back to the results of that service and sacrifice in the Second World War. It's not just about that period, because many things have happened since, and conflicts have happened since too, that have shaped the modern world, particularly in the early part of this century, for example. But I think it's important to understand where we come from and who we are and what people in previous generations have done and have experienced. And even if politicians don't learn lessons from that, these are people that we can look at and draw lessons from within ourselves, in terms of what it means to be human, what it means to believe in something and stand up for it and fight against tyranny, against darkness, and all the other things that those generations had to face in those periods of the two world wars. And I think that's something that's worth remembering. War memorials are not just lists of abstract names. They're ordinary people that lived and breathed and hoped and dreamed and loved and did everything that we do now. And I think it's important that they remain in our consciousness, as well as those who served. Most men and women came back from those two great wars. It's not just the dead, but we're all connected to it somehow through our family trees, and it's a subject that will always be a part of British and Commonwealth history,
Yeah,
world
couldn't agree.
history.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. And looking to the present day and maybe slightly ahead in the future, do you think countries like Britain are right now prepared for a war? And do you think maybe the UK, for example, should spend more on military budget? Or do you think it's just when the time comes, or if the time comes, unfortunately, we'd have to up our and increase our spending? Do you think it's more reactionary in the present day for military?
I mean, I think it's dangerous for historians to be military pundits, and I would not claim to be one. And there's lots of opinions. Everyone has an opinion about Ukraine in the first weeks of war, and continue to have opinions about the course of that conflict, for example, and what threat Russia does or does not pose. Whether Britain is prepared for war, I think, is a different kind of subject. I think there are very few European nations that are truly prepared for any kind of big conflict, because we've lived in the outcome of a war that was never fought, which is the Cold War. The Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and a belief that that kind of war was now redundant, and that European peace was secured, and that there would not be war in Europe again. And here we are, all these decades later, and there is conflict in Europe, and there's been conflict in Europe since, in Bosnia, for example, in the 1990s, is another good example of that. So, I mean, countries are never prepared for war. They're both prepared and unprepared. Armies will always say we're ready for the next conflict, and the next conflict will be shaped in a way that they can't imagine. And if we look at the way combat has developed within Ukraine from its earliest moments of that Russian invasion a few years ago through to what we see now, and the importance of weapons, that don't cost millions of pounds, but can have a profound effect on a battlefield, and that's drones. Then few would have predicted warfare would necessarily go in that direction. And if you look at the history, every time anyone says that weapon is redundant or will never use that weapon again, you can pretty much guarantee that weapon will be used in the foreseeable future, because every time something is deemed to have passed its sell-by date, probably it hasn't.
You've kind of like sprung up a memory in my mind. I don't know if it's the Russian-Ukraine war right now, but aren't they using some soldiers are using some sort of technology or weapons from maybe World War II or some? Are there any weapons that were deemed redundant now that are now being used in that war? Do you have any examples?
I mean, you see kind of kit that was used in the early stage of the Russian invasion. They were using Czech hedgehogs dragged out of a Second World War museum as roadblocks. Wow. And there's film of First World War Russian Maxim machine guns being used by the Ukrainians, which have been rechambered to new ammunition. I mean, that's not unusual in any conflict. Some of the mortars that were used on the Western Front in the early phase of trench warfare, I'm not saying they were dragged out of museums, but they were certainly museum pieces in their own right. And if you look at home defence in the Second World War, the Home Guard had a right kind of ragtag group of weapons, from broom handles through to Napoleonic muskets through to God knows what, until they had Tommy guns and BARs and everything else that America supplied through Lend-Lease. So that kind of thing happens. But and trench warfare, no one British Army had kind of thought that kind of warfare would never take place again, and they're now investing time, resources, and understanding in what trench warfare is, because it's proved once more to have emerged from the past and now be very much part of the present.
Yeah, trench warfare with drones.
Yeah.
It's a horrifying imagination.
But like I say, I'm not a military pundit. I wouldn't dare. I wouldn't disrespect those who are actually having to fight this war to offer any kind of analysis of it, because we only know what we see in news feeds. We don't really see the reality and the truth of what it's like on the ground there. So I think any kind of insight into it is always speculative. That's the difference between trying to study something that's actually happening and study something that's in the past.
Yeah, and that was the case for both of the world wars as well, right, at the time?
Yeah, so if you had a folder full of Daily Mail news reports of World War II, you're not going to write a definitive account of the Second World War with those, because half of it's going to be propaganda anyway.
Yeah. Paul Reed, ladies and gentlemen. Paul, thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and would love to chat to you again in the future about more World War stuff, maybe more about World War II next time. But I hope the audience learned as much as I did, especially about the veteran stories and what it was truly like in the trenches. Where can people go if they want to find your work?
So I'm pretty easy to find on the internet. Paul Reed, military historian, will kind of take you to quite a few different sites. My podcast, The Old Frontline, about the First World War, is on all the usual platforms, and there's a YouTube channel for it as well, with videos about the First World War. If I had more hours in the day, I'd probably have a World War II podcast and YouTube channel, but until I retire, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But I'm still lucky to do what is my day job, which is battlefield tours with Ledger Holidays. We're the largest UK battlefield tour operator, UK-based tour operator, doing tours all over the world to First and Second World War battlefield. So I'm lucky that my hobby, my interest, my passion is my job as well. So very fortunate person indeed.
Awesome. I'll leave the links to those in the description, and that sounds like a very cool trip to potentially do in the future, going around the world, looking at some battlefields. I mean, I went to eat when I was in year 8. Don't suppose you were there when I was there at the time, but just seeing
Who
the
knows?
trenches and seeing all the graveyards, I think it's so important for especially young people, teenagers maybe, to have that almost first-hand physical experience of being where a battle was. I was just wondering what projects are you currently working on? You've mentioned the podcasts and leisure holidays. Is that two things that you're mainly doing?
Yeah, I mean, the podcast comes out every week, so that's kind of as I'm sure you know yourself, it's kind of a
Yeah.
full-time job,
Yeah. Yeah.
trying to manage a podcast. So that keeps me busy, and I pop over to the battlefields on a regular basis to kind of record stuff over there and see, things. The landscape changes. They're building a new super canal in northern France, which will result in a huge amount of archaeology, I suspect. So that's going to be interesting to see. Battlefields never stand still. There's always something happening, and the landscape reveals its secrets year in and year out, and that's what makes it fascinating.
Exactly. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you for your time, and hopefully speak to you soon.
Thank you, Jacob. It's been a pleasure. Take care.
Brilliant.
If you want to know the full step-by-step process I use to go from 0 subscribers and 0 guests and 0 idea of how to start a podcast to a ton of high-end guests, professional-looking video, professional-looking audio quality, social media clips of the podcast that have generated over 2.5 million views in the last 2 to 3 months, then join my tribe of Outliers. It's a community for curious, like-minded people who either want to start their own podcast or are interested in improving themselves and understanding the world around them. 2, you'll get access to my step-by-step podcast blueprint program, as well as many other self-improvement videos, which can help you improve your life. You'll finally be able to meet your like-minded tribe of people who are into podcasting, into self-growth, and into understanding the world around them. Because let's be real, the people that are into those 3 things are very rare individuals. That's why I called it Tribe of Outliers. So if you want to know how to start your podcast using the blueprint I used to go from 0 to a successful show that's continuing to grow to this day, literally I'll hold your hand and walk you through the step-by-step process, including how to email guests, what to put in your emails, how to edit it, how to repurpose it, how to use Riverside FM software, but also how to do it all with the equipment I've said in this video, how to network with guests, how to write video descriptions, where to upload it to. I'll literally just tell you every single step to turn you into a pro podcaster and get big name guests and a loyal audience like I have, as well as getting my episodes 24 hours before anyone else, getting guest previews before the show even comes out, as well as join weekly live calls with myself and the tribe, helping you improve your podcast and yourself every single week. It's an absolute no-brainer. It's for curious people who are into self-improvement and also who want to start their own podcast. So if you want to become an outlier today and join the tribe of like-minded people and get direct access to me and my blueprints, which have helped me improve my podcast and my life, click the link in the description